Mykhailo, it's time somehow to make the summary of 2016, and you were now can also comment for the very interesting survey which done by the UNDP regarding the civil position of the society in Ukraine, Moldova and Belarus. So what are the main findings? What is the surprising things? What we somehow should know about the citizenship in this part of the world?
Yes, it was a very interesting research made by UNDP in Ukraine and also our partners in Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, funded by Danish government. The research shows three elements of our civility. So civic knowledge or civic literacy, civic practices or participation in civic practices, and civic values. And it's been compared with findings from Belarus and Moldova. So we, as Ukrainians, we really have problems with understanding our rights. So civic rights, civic liberties are understood as the liberty for job or for work placement, for participation in elections, and having good access to education and medical services. However, in its 25% is the biggest understanding that the liberty to have a job, for example, is the highest knowledge of civic right. But in Belarus, for example, over 50% talk about the right for life as the core civic right. Or in Moldova, Moldovans and Ukrainians are pretty similar in this approach. So in a way, my interpretation here is that those nations that were gone through the war actually have a different understanding what the right to life is. And theoretically, the Belarusians who never had war in recent 25 years, they think in terms of right to life more. When we talk about practices, Ukrainians and Moldovans are quite active, and they say that they are active, and when we check, they are also active by personal participation or personal experience. So here we can say that knowledge of civic rights, of civil rights, and practices of Ukrainians and Moldovans, they match. Although, of course, Ukrainians have a tendency to overestimate their civic activism. In Belarus, and it's quite clear that the civic activism has a much lower impact. Then, when we look at values, we're basically on the same page in all three countries. But again, we don't have like values that consolidate societies very much. Anyway, the research on values in Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, they show that these three societies are pretty much disoriented. So also the common understanding is that in Moldova and in Ukraine, and especially in Ukraine, there is a big demand for knowledge about civic rights and liberties, also about civic obligations, and understanding what are the civic obligations in Ukraine are pretty low. So there is a demand for more civic education.
And where are the gaps?
Well, the biggest gap for me, just one of several, is understanding where the source of power is. So when sociologists were asking Ukrainians who or what is the source of power, Ukrainians were split into two-thirds. One-third was saying that it's people, it's the people, so according to constitution. The others were saying that it's president. And sociologists were saying, okay, this group that was saying, this one-third of nation that was saying that the president is the source of power is wrong. But maybe they are realists and they assess the situation the way it is. So,
what makes you concerned and what makes you hopeful for this time, for the next year?
Well, for me, the hope is that there is a demand for knowing more, but there's no supply, and this makes me, concerned. First of all, the intellectuals, intelligentsia in Ukraine must provide supply to this demand, we have to go to people and to be more active in disseminating information about basic rights and liberties and basic civic obligations.
Besides this particular research, I know you also were studying and learning more about this kind of pretty unknown data about the public opinion in the occupied territories of Donbas, of the Ukrainian East, and also the front line. Which there was no much comprehensive studies. So what we need to know about the, how do people feel about the current thing, how radical they are, how ready are they for any kind of a dialogue, and what impacts their, attitude.
Right. Well, from the polls and researches that were recently made but not yet published, they show that the population of Donbas is split in two groups, those who live under control of separatists and those who live within Ukraine. And within Ukraine, Donbas population has a big group, a quarter of population, which is very loyal and adhered to Ukraine as a political entity. But there's also a pretty big group of population, about 20%, 1/5, that is quite pro-Russian. And in between of these two groups, there's this the group of people who tend to hide their opinions, they want to survive, and who are very critical towards Kiev, towards Donbas, and towards Moscow. On the other side, on the territory controlled by separatists, we have about a quarter of those who support the local regime. There's also about 17%, 16, a little bit less than 1/5 of population that is very much pro-Ukrainian. So there's a base for us to go to outreach to these populations. But in between, it's about 60% of population are those who want to survive whatsoever and who are also very critical to whichever government they have experience of dealing with. So I read these figures as existence of a big resource for the future reintegration of Ukraine. But the time goes, and this time works against us, against unified Ukraine, which means that the peace process should be sped up and we have to rebuild Ukraine, well, also taking into account this data.
And finally, when you really look these days with the way how the media operate, that's our reality. It's not just something to complain. It's always think that society is radicalized when the society lives in conflict. But what is interesting for me in different kind of surveys, you see the statistics which shows that it's more like open for any compromise or dialogue or something. So what are your knowledge, let's say, not the feeling, because the feeling we read from, I don't know, Facebook.
Yeah, there is a number of recent polls and researches made by sociologists in Ukraine, and it shows that the audience, basically, those who are looking at the media, people, the general population, is much more tolerant and much more rational than Ukrainian media. In Ukrainian media, also social media, the radicalism is much more spread, and intolerance is much more spread than in general population, which gives me this old populist wisdom that people, the people are wiser than the elites. Well, let it be so.
Okay, well, let's see how the 2017 will be. Thank you.
Thank you.